The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. Carl Sagan.
Welcome to the Lessons from Nature podcast, modeling the secrets of the bees. Hosted by Mark Rubin.
If you hear my voice, you're alive. And if you're alive, you've been investing in solving problems today, so you don't need to spend more money to fix them tomorrow. This means you must be part of a tribe of people who plan ahead to reduce costs. Today on the Lessons from Nature podcast, we'll be discussing Secret 20 from Honey is Money. It costs more later. It's about the idea that many problems get worse over time. This means that the cost to fix things escalates over time. It's wise to address expensive problems as quickly as possible. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Dr. Jamie Saras. Jamie is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, Maynooth University. He holds advanced degrees in social cultural anthropology from the University of Chicago with an MA and a PhD. He also has completed a postdoctoral fellowship in clinically relevant medical anthropology in the Department of Social Medicine, Harvard Medical School. Jamie will co-host 4 episodes of the Lessons from Nature podcast with me, where we will discuss the anthropological secrets of the bees through the lens of the human business of making money and the bee business of making honey. Welcome, Jamie. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So I'm going to kick things off with a short story today, and an investment I made that paid off. I had a little tiny home built in Utah, designed everything the way I wanted, elevations, roof deck, all kinds of cool stuff, propane on the roof, water on the roof so I could have like a bathtub up there, everything I want, all the stuff. And we plugged it into water, we plugged it into power, things were looking good. And I decided before like the final connection was made to the water that I was going to get a magical switch that I could control over the internet, a Wi-Fi enabled water controlling thing that also had sensors, that if there was any water, like anywhere that there would be a problem, it would magically turn things off. It was like a $400 system, this thing, $400. I'm like, what are the odds? Basically, the system came, it got installed. I put my sensors down. Same day, my wife was there. We went out to lunch and drove away 5 minutes and I got an alarm on my phone. There was an alarm. And I thought, I was like, thing's defective. Must be, of course. The first thought is, it's defective. No. And when we got back, I looked, and under the sink where I'd put the towels, I had knocked off one of the pipes because it was only hand tight. And
Sure.
They drove this truck like 3,000 miles across the country and like whatever bad luck, but it worked. And I had already written Honey is Money. And I thought, I looked at my wife, I said, it costs more later. So I've been saving this story for, 6 months for now as the example of investing today in something, spending money, which takes work, which takes time, effort, and risk, doing something today to prevent a problem later. And that is the topic we're going to discuss today. So the first one I'm going to talk about, the idea of sharing resources and knowledge from an anthropological perspective across cultures and maybe even across time, about how knowledge can be shared, propelled into the future in different ways. And the specific example I'm going to give here is building a dam. A lot of times I've noticed on a map that countries are split with water. So there's often rivers in between countries. And there's occasionally dams on those rivers creating reservoirs for electricity and for water storage. But that means there's always someone downstream. There's always someone downstream that's relying on a release of water at a certain rate at a certain time. And they're scaling their empire and civilization downstream in some kind of trusted relationship with the people that operate the dam upstream. Is that this creates both the potential for cooperation and collaboration and also the potential for control and disaster. How is knowledge and resource sharing managed in different cultures and across cultures in a way that reduces long-term cost, or is it not?
Oh, that's a simple question. So it's no problem. Well, I mean, there's a few things. I mean, there's a kind of truism in archaeology that, every great civilization, you see a great river. The Nile, obviously, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Yellow River in China. And a lot of civilizational growth is tied into the management of water resources.
Mm.
Probably most clearly in the great civilization of Asia, particularly China, where in older anthropology you would use the term hydraulic despotism, where you would actually concentrate all the water resources in one kind of central power who would then be able to dole it out within, certainly at a regional level, and therefore would have literally a godlike ability to
Yeah.
provide feast or famine. You see these even at a granular level. One of my professors at Chicago, the great Marshall Solins, worked closely with an archaeologist in Hawaii, was able to chart how Kamehameha, the great, the High King that kind of unified Hawaii, would pension off his regiments in this one area. I think it was the Big Island. You could still see the evidence of the irrigation
Mm.
canals, and the ability to block off one or the other showed, you could still find the evidence of that, of who had more power than, the other person. So, this is a enduring theme in civilization, broadly in human civilization. Now that takes a fair bit of forward planning, but along with that forward planning, you often see a centralization of power, and that power usually has different ideas than forward planning. You see in some of these hydraulic civilization, I'm thinking of the Khmer, modern day Cambodia, where the hydraulic skill level was extraordinarily high.
Mm.
And clearly those engineers were literally centuries ahead of anything that Europe was at the time. But they push things, they seem to be at the limit of the environmental carrying load. And when the climate changed slightly, they had a lot of problems. I mean, again, that goes down to this sort of rule that systems that run at 100% efficiency aren't efficient. They're actually, they're a hostage to fortune, because,
Ah,
such systems don't change usually very easily. They tend to fail catastrophically,
yeah,
and,
that's right.
and so that relationship about the forward planning to exercise that amount of control over water, the power that comes with that is very often yoked into not necessarily short term, because you're very often producing symbols, you're producing buildings, you're producing things that are going to be around for a long time, but that production is incompatible sometimes with keeping that population together, and that's where we get ruined cities. So you can plan for the endurance of certain things, but fail the people who are the necessary bearers of those things. And so, humans have that peculiar capacity to imagine long term ideas that, to the extent they work, they make the civilization impossible.
That's a well said, as always. I have a question. Isn't there a dam on the Nile River? Is it the Aswan Dam? Is that on
That's
the?
from the high dam, the Aswan high dam. Yep. Well, for the most part, it's from what the Egyptians took water away from Egypt, because obviously, the river flows south to north.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
what they ended up doing though was flooding some of their major archaeological sites. The Anzra High Dam only took away a certain older style agriculture
Right.
away from northern Egypt. Now, that was a Soviet inspired, but that was, if you think about the 20th century, the early 20th century was was dam building as
Yeah.
the highest example of the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United
Right.
States. In Ireland, Ardnacrusha, which dams the Shannon, which becomes the basis of rural electrification in Ireland. These are big state projects where the nation state sort of both delivers services to its people, but also represents itself at the same time, symbolically. But you are seeing that the ability to control water, I mean, right now, the war in Israel is obscuring other things, but there have been very talks about, damming the Jordan. There's very talks between Syria, Iraq, and the various countries that rely on the Tigris and Euphrates. The various countries, have gone up to and including threatening war,
Yeah.
for those kinds of things, because that is one of the obvious differences now. The reach of populations downstream are much further than they used to be.
Well, so I think I want to close this one out with the idea that if a big dam is built in Egypt and long-term planning is not implemented as part of the design, then the people there are in denial. What? That was it? I was saving that for like 5 minutes. Okay, that was good. That was the best I could do. Okay.
No, I like it. I like it. If you're gonna talk about the Anwar High Dam and talk about these sorts of things, being in denial, probably the best joke you'd be able to make out of it. So no.
Okay, let's talk about collective decision making, especially collective decision making across cultures and organizations. And we could frame this like around the UN, but like I don't know enough about those structures to even know if this is a real representation of anything. But here we go. So humans can use collective decision making and gather different perspectives from other cultures and societies and make informed decisions together. Can you think of some examples of how collective decision making about fixing problems today versus waiting until we're forced to do something have been successful?
There are more examples that I could think of being forced to do something. And I think that is part of at what point do you recognize a crisis? Are we at crisis now? And, one of the things about climate denialists now is you notice that there's funding for a new kind of denialism, which starts to concede we're in a crisis, but it's too late to stop the crisis. Yeah. Now we have to talk about resilience,
right.
Which again means we don't really have to change very much. Examples of collective decision making across cultures and states that worked. Some of the big development projects post-war might fit some of that. I mean, people forget about the successes. It's very popular, and I'm quite willing to critique those because they were unsustainable as we have kind of understood it now. But if you looked at, say, that high moment of technocratic optimism, say in the 1950s, you saw, massive gains made against malaria with, much maligned DDT. People forget that, Sri Lanka spent some time malaria free because of that. Now, when malaria came back, the population had lost any residual resistance, and it was, it was almost worse in a way. But there was this idea that we could work together to do that. Now, very often was indifferent to certain kinds of, problematic political groups, but that would fail on the long-term kind of planning because it never really had occurred, to people that mosquitoes were as resilient as, they turned out to be. DDT was so devastating to insects. A duck could skim on a pond that had DDT on it and then, settle for a minute and fly off. And if it dropped in another pond, just set down in another pond, the residual DDT was sufficient before mosquitoes had resistance that every mosquito larva in that pond would be killed. People think, well, geez, what's, a few mosquitoes becoming extinct, they're responsible for more human deaths in our lineage than every other cause combined through malaria, most likely. But it turns out that there are a lot of, in the web of consequences of pulling an entire species out, but the thinking of the planning that humans had available to them at that time, at least Western white males, elite science, etc., had a very linear kind of understanding of causality. And, you break that vector chain, you stop this horrible disease, many, many more people live dignified lives. It turns out to be much more complex. And indeed, it's only sometimes when one intervenes in a system that the complexity of that system becomes apparent to the person intervening. And sometimes that can be, you come to catastrophe or near catastrophe before, you actually see that this is a problem. I think climate change is very different. We've known this now for more than a half a century, really 70 years. And there's just been a strong short-term economic motive not to deal with the problem.
And that really is an important thing to explore. And back to climate deniers, I saw somebody post something about more people die from cold than heat because the statistics don't cover like floods, famines, or wars or whatever. They're just talking about the thermodynamic idea of freezing to death versus having too much heat to survive.
Yeah.
That's an example of something being true. And it is true that is true, but it is not the broad context of what we're talking about. And that's the exact way of thinking that this episode of the podcast is trying to address, is that there is truth in what that person said. I don't dispute, but the definition of where the system starts and stops too narrow.
We could step one step back because I know that stat very well, and I've been involved in several online arguments, and they compare the differences between dying of hypothermia and dying of heat stroke.
Right.
It's not even tendentious, it's mischievous. Because, if you went to an undergraduate public health course and said something similar, every undergraduate in the room would laugh at you. Like if you were going to really chart the deaths of heats, and this is what the UN does, and this is what every credible public health body does, you'd have to talk about morbidity, mortality for heart attacks, for breathing difficulties, and when you combine those, which are directly heat related,
I see.
Even within that narrow frame, heat wins, by a country mile. So at this point in time, if you're using that statistic, you're being mischievous.
Or you're being funded by somebody that, is gains from this. But that's like saying there's only one cause of death for mammals, and that's the lack of oxygen to the brain. So basically it's like, that's true. Okay. Yeah, but it doesn't help. Basically, it's like things could either help or hurt. Okay. And if longevity and long-term thriving, we talked about this earlier, is that there's not an agreed upon goal of is the goal, I would think, I make this up because I have kids, but one reasonable goal seems to me that future generations live longer lifespans than present generations, all things considered, not just health, but war, disease, everything. And we see in the US that lifespans are shrinking for different reasons. Yeah. And that includes everything, different epidemics of drug abuse and different everything combined create these situations. And I guess the idea that it costs more later, if we could define what it is that we're trying to maximize, which the problem I think is quarterly profits driven by stock markets instead of lifespans, or like you said, a dignity, or defining things in a way that we can agree upon across cultures, across everything, that we want everyone to be educated at a certain standard, want everyone to have opportunities, and we'll measure this success by lifespan. Okay, because that's the metric that combines everything else. I think that without doing that we have this short-term thinking or special interest thinking that hurts the world. So what do you think about that?
I think that for much of human history, population lifespan was a pretty fair proxy for the population doing better. Mm-hmm. What we're seeing now is a really kind of unprecedented. So we started to take, statistics, which is states that we're starting to see in the wealthiest places on the globe, a flattening, or at least some of the wealthiest places on the globe, a flattening of life expectancy. That's highly correlated to inequalities. And it's highly correlated to societies that have chronic problems that they've known about for a long time, of just not, fixing them, or not even pretending that they're problems, and so then you're involved in a kind of question about politics and really philosophy, or at least worldview. What's the point? Why do we get out of bed in the morning? But I think with respect to one imagines that one's children will live better than they will.
Yeah,
I think,
better.
is probably a defining modern worldview. The idea that at a generational level, people will do better. For a lot of human history, there was an entire infrastructure and multiple industries built around horses. There was talk about horse management, and there were fines for your horse shitting in the street and not, and about 20 years from, or less than 20 years for Henry Ford, just
Mhm.
about in that period of time. Of course, World War One kind of interrupts it a bit. You have that entire industry disappear, and it doesn't disappear by planning.
No.
It doesn't disappear, and all those horses disappear too. To effectively sort of I guess leisure. I mean, you have to go out of their way, you little side tracks, at a stable, and you can ride a horse. Perhaps at some point, I mean, those are the technological disruptor kind of things that, a credible power source that can be put in a car will leave the internal combustion engine, or at least, in its modern form, add a lot of the oil infrastructure in the same kind of way. And this is and some of the guys who run the oil industry kind of know this. You didn't leave the Stone Age because you ran out of stones. It's just there were other things that became available. And then stones, there are masons, you still built with stones, but when bronze became widely available, flint knapping suddenly became a kind of specialty thing. But those things change oftentimes without planning in the sense that we're using it here. And I think that that's where this sort of a certain kind of technological optimism is looking to, either hydrogen or a better battery
Mhm.
at that granular level for cars, and probably fusion,
Yeah.
at that other
Eventually.
level.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We need clean, low cost energy production and clean, low cost energy storage. And we also need to improve energy density so things are lighter. And if we
absolutely.
can do that, then the problem is largely solved. At least that part of the problem is largely
Yeah.
solved. But I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy just burning gasoline in trash cans for whatever
Absolutely.
reason that
Oh, yeah,
they like the smell.
absolutely.
They like the
Yeah,
smell. So it's
yeah,
like, it's like whatever it is.
yeah. And you will probably have, I mean, before that, when self-driving cars become a more viable option, where it will be obvious that they make better decisions about driving than not just some people or most people, than everyone, then you will probably have people who will gravitate to these racetracks where you can drive your own,
Yeah,
because I
that's
don't
right.
know, somehow I'm in my masculinity is invested in my car, and that's been stripped of me by, um, which I'm sure people felt that way about their horses. Now, in
Sure.
fairness,
Sure.
that riding a horse was a more masculine activity than simply sitting down and expending no energy, except for shifting a couple of gears and moving a wheel.
Yeah.
That seems kind of cheating, particularly for the distances that you cover. And of course, sure, you have to maintain a car. And some men do scarily have relationships to their car, but it was nothing like the relationship one had to have with a horse.
It's funny you say that because first of all, I have a horse. And second of all, and I have a car. And the exit for this podcast is talking about exactly what you just said, which I'm not going to give it away. So I guess I'm going to leave it to you just for like a couple minutes. What wisdom can you share about things that you've either seen or read about or heard about where human beings made decisions today? They invested in things that were hard to overcome challenges. Like what can you leave us with in an optimistic way that there's hope for our species?
Well, I'll start with the less optimistic way because, humans have thought about this for a long time. There's the parable of the Sibylline books, which goes like an old woman is carrying a big set of books that has all of human knowledge. And she goes to a very wealthy city and says, I will sell you all of human knowledge for, 100 gold pieces. And this will future proof you.
Mm,
Everything that you could possibly imagine. They're quite comfortable, and they're trying to explain to the woman, 100 gold pieces, that's a pretty fair bit of money. And these books are, they look great and everything, but I don't know, we don't have enough time to read them in there. And she goes, okay, could I borrow some kindling and sticks from you? And they go, yeah, Gran. And she burns half of the books
Mm.
because she doesn't want to carry it around. 10 years later, she comes back. City's doing a little less well, and crops are not as good as they used to be. The weather is a little worse. And she goes and she says, you can have half a human knowledge, but the price is now 200 gold
Mm.
pieces. I go, well, Jesus, it was only 100, we don't really have the same amount of money. I don't think, and the process repeats, and it repeats and it repeats. It just has one book and it costs thousands, so, this is, humans have told themselves stories. It's like they've not been unaware of it.
Right.
And one of the things about being long-lived allows at least some members of the population to have that memory. And of course, language and culture allows these things to be passed on. So it's not like we're a particularly venal example of our species in this time and place. There are venal examples among us, and they have, there are bad people, but this is something that we have kind of struggled with. Now, the flip side, or the other side, the more optimistic side, our species has weathered like ridiculous crises, not just recently, but in our evolutionary career. We've
Mhm.
been shrunk down to a couple hundred,
Oh,
before we were human, 900,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, we had another, massive, massive bottleneck. Um, and we came through those. So that question about, we have certainly been able to resiliently rebuild.
mm.
The question about the Anthropocene, and this is where I think it's often miscast. I think if we taught it more that it is not the world that is at stake, it's the conditions of possibility of 8 to 10 billion naked monkeys
Yeah.
surviving with a minimal level of dignity that is at stake. So,
Mm.
yes, there are some creatures that we have probably queued up on the execution block that are ahead of us.
Mhm.
Nearly all the big predators that we like, we might finally be able to get rid of them, down to probably the size of coyotes. But
Wow.
we've tried to get rid of coyotes and failed utterly.
Yeah.
Just behind them is us,
Yeah.
and like even if us survive, the numbers that will survive and the quality of life that will survive are simply not enough. And it's that change of consciousness that kind of needs to happen. I see that much more in younger people. I think we're going to actually be quite shocked in the United States with the group of people who are coming online to vote now. They have no memory of the Cold War.
Mm.
It never happened. They are digital residents, not digital nomads. And more
Yeah.
than that, they're much more centrally involved in social media kind of thing. A lot of things are spectacularly not interesting to them. They might like their country, but the idea of a patriotic mission
Yeah.
or, but they are interested passionately in things like the environment. We are likely to see a tectonic shift in voting behavior in places like the United States. I certainly expected in this election coming up next year in Ireland, where environmentalism becomes less a preserve of worried middle classes and a central feature of how governance is thought through. And it will probably have far less of a hangover of conservation and a kind of beneficent paternalism towards nature,
Good.
and a healthy amount of terror that we live on a set of interconnecting systems that we are just coming to understand at the point that we are threatening their balance in such a way that we can make our form of life impossible. And I think that that's going to be where a lot of these questions are going to be sorted out. So I'm not unoptimistic for the generation of humans that are coming, but I think it's an open question whether our ingenuity and generalized goodwill is up for the challenge that is in front of us.
Well said, Jamie. I appreciate that, and that is a great way to end this. I want to add one thing is that the first episode of Honey is Money and also the podcast is called Life is Lucky. And it starts with the idea that the conditions that support life are rare in the universe. As far as it starts with me looking through a telescope and looking at the universe and seeing all these amazing things and not seeing one other living thing unless I looked around where I was. And I thought, life is lucky. And so basically I want to end this one with the idea that life is lucky and that the generation that's coming through now can lead to change, to improve things, both through this sort of benevolent idea that we're part of a living system and that they are afraid of what might happen if they don't take corrective action. And then maybe they won't play the game of it costs more later. Cross your fingers. All living things that cooperate follow principles of anthropology. If you did any work today to prevent expensive problems in the future, you're investing in solving problems that cost more later. And that reminds me, it's almost time to get an oil change in my car. Investing in preventative maintenance is less expensive than fixing broken stuff in the future. It would be wise to do some preventative maintenance on our planetary social systems so you don't have to solve expensive problems in the future. If you enjoyed this discussion about anthropology and the way bees and companies and people and civilizations are similar, subscribe to the Lessons from Nature podcast, where we're modeling the secrets of the bees. On the next episode of the podcast, I talk with David Houle. David is a catalyst for creative thinking and creating a better tomorrow. He's a futurologist, a big thinker, and a great communicator. Visit projecthoneylight.life for more information about living in harmony with the rest of nature. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Mark.